Today we're going to take a look at how to create incidents as related to Massachusetts SIF requirements. So once we log into MMS Generations and open the database, we need to confirm that we're viewing the correct school and school year where we want to create the incident. So in this instance, I happen to be looking at the high school for the current school year. In this Tech Byte, we'll give an overview of incidents that are specific to Massachusetts state reporting, including where to locate the MMS documentation for Massachusetts, how to create an incident in MMS, the SIF specific fields for incidents, and then how to assign that incident to a student. So just as an overview, we'll just take a moment to talk about why we're creating incidents for Massachusetts as related to the SIF reporting. Incident reporting is required for Massachusetts to gather information on any offenses involving drug, violent, or crime-related incidents on school property and the related disciplinary action for the offender. In addition, it includes offenses that violate the Student Code of Conduct and any related disciplinary action. The School Safety and Discipline Reporting, or SSDR, includes all disciplinary offenses, and even if the drug, violence, or crime-related incident doesn't result in suspension, the offense needs to be reported. So MMS gives schools the ability to capture this discipline information for reporting purposes. We'll take just a moment to take a look at the documentation for the state of Massachusetts in MMS. If you log in with your account number, choose the downloads and updates, and then I'm going to choose Massachusetts. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you see the View Download option, and that will provide you with a PDF document that has all the details you will need for the discipline reporting. And we'll be referring to some of that documentation. The implementation guidelines are included, and there's some information coming directly from the Massachusetts Department of Education, and then also some configuration information as far as codes that need to be entered in MMS for infractions and actions. So you'll see an entire list of those codes included, and we'll take a look at where those are available in Generations. So moving back over to MMS Generations, if we go to Discipline Reporting, More Discipline Editing Jobs, there's an option to edit infraction codes. So that's where those will need to be entered for Massachusetts state reporting of discipline. And these codes and descriptions are aligned with the documentation that I showed you. And then you can also indicate whether those infractions that will then come into play once the incident is created, if they involve drugs and alcohol, violence, weapons, or bullying, and also if you use the web portals for discipline, if that is an infraction code that's available in the web portals. And then in a similar fashion, you have the action codes, and those also are included in the documentation that we looked at. So that's where those come from. So when a reportable disciplinary offense occurs, what you will need to do is create a discipline incident record through the discipline editor. Have an option to edit incidents. And these are incidents that have been recorded thus far. And so if an incident occurs at the school, a reportable incident, what we would need to do is add a new record for that incident. And then we see an option to add the incident ID. What some schools do is to classify and group the incidents. If it's an instance of violence, for example, they might preface it with a VIO. If it happens to be drug related, to preface it that way. And then the length of the incident ID can set that the way that your school wants to capture the length of that ID according to the convention or school policy that you decide on. And if you say suggest next number, MMS will calculate what is the next number in the series for you. And that will allow you to keep those incident ID numbers unique. And MMS does check within the school database to make sure that this incident that we're looking at is a unique incident ID number, and will notify you if that is not the case and give you the opportunity to change it. So in this instance, we created the incident ID, and then what we need to do is move across to the right-hand side of the screen. So what we're going to do first of all here is enter the description of the incident. And you notice that the date pre-fills with today's date. You can put in the time when that incident occurred. Also the location. And the list from the location comes from the rooms table in school management jobs. So perhaps it occurred at a school-sponsored event that was after school. You could choose that. So you may need to update your room table. So you have examples such as bus, school event, parking lot, those kinds of things. And then what you'll see as you scroll to the right is that you can capture the number of student offenders, non-student offenders, unknown offenders, and then also victims from the student, number of personnel, non-school personnel, and unknown victims. So there's a good amount of information that you can capture here that will then be included when you export that information. And then also you can note whether the particular incident involves drugs or alcohol, violence, a weapon, or bullying. You can include any additional notes here. And that's just an example. And then what you'll see is that if you go back, then you can read that particular note that was entered. And then there is additional information that can be entered for the incident. The SIF incident description. This used to be located in the Massachusetts specific menu, but now it is located here in the discipline editor. So this is a field that was added, and you can capture other information about the incident. So we now have an additional level of description here. We also have the ability to capture the time when the incident occurred, to categorize the time, who reported the incident, the actual incident category, the location specifically where that occurred for SIF reporting purposes, and then again what that in fact is related to, whether it's alcohol, drugs, weapons, etc. So all of that information can be captured directly within the incident. And then once you have completed that information, then you can go ahead and save that. If there are in fact victims that need to be attached to that particular incident, like in the instance of a fight or weapons usage or something of that nature, you have the victims tab here. And if we choose add student victims, it's going to choose, or it's going to give us the option to choose students in the school that we're viewing here. If we choose to include victims from all schools, then when we choose add student victims, it brings over a student list from all the campuses. Certainly possible that you might need to choose from the list of all students. So in this instance, I'll just choose a student just for the purpose of illustrating. And so it will pull through that student ID, the name, whether the student was referred in any way, the injury severity as well, and that specific drop-down is specific to SIF reporting. And the options you see here are the valid codes. If SIF 2.7 is installed, then these will already exist in the dropdown. If not, they would need to be added to the valid data selection editor. And that's located, just for your information, if there are options you need to add in the dropdowns for anything that we're looking at, those are located in the admin menu in the valid data selection table editor. So what we would need to do is find the specific table that relates to the operation that we're looking at, and we would be able to add or modify or change the drop-down options as needed. And if you need to include a note of some kind, I know I noted that my student did not receive any injuries in this instance, but if you needed to indicate like a nurse office visit, you could attach that as well, minor scratches or whatever the case may be. This is just intended to be a sample note. And then we would go ahead and save that information. So now we have created that incident and the related information. I'm going to save and exit out of there. And then what we would do next to assign that particular incident to the student offender is we would go to the student discipline editor, and we would need to locate the offending student. And I'll just choose Charles in this instance. And what we would need to do, this indicates the actual infraction itself that occurred, very specifically the infraction by code according to the SIF documentation and codes that we looked at in the documentation, these particular infraction codes. And when we choose to add an infraction, what you're going to see is that we choose the incident that that's related to. So we would choose the incident that we just created, and it will remind us to choose an infraction code, and it will know whether that particular infraction code is related to drugs and alcohol, weapons, etc., from the way we set up the codes. And then we can also indicate staff. It pulls through any previously entered information, where it occurred, when it occurred, and if there's any additional information to be entered, you continue to scroll to the right and enter that specific information. And then one more note on these codes, you see there are fields such as SIF other offense description, SIF other weapon description. So that whether you put information in that particular field will depend on what the infraction code is that's assigned. So you can see that, for example, if we choose the code of 1F for possession of other illegal substances, then in that instance, the SIF other offense description must contain a description of the substance. And then same when we get down to weapons, if it's 14B4 for the infraction code of other firearm, then the SIF other weapon description must contain a more specific description of the weapon. So the information you enter then will be based on the specific infraction. And then as you scroll to the right, then you see additional information that you have the ability to enter. And again, the documentation that we looked at has more details on the specifics of that. You also have your MMS help available as an additional resource for you. Also, then when we look at the action that's associated with the infraction, what action was taken, whether it was an expulsion, suspension, demerits, or whatever the case may be, we add the associated action, the dates, the action according to the codes that we looked at in the documentations. In the documentation, we'd have to choose the particular code, and then it will also pre-fill some of the additional information based on the action codes we set up and assign a number of units, like if it's an in-school suspension, how many days that may be, and so forth. We can put in any more additional details, who approved that, and some of the SIF related information. Again, there are some defaults such as the SIF superintendent appeal, which defaults to a no. If that needs to be changed, it can be. And then there's also some additional fields available: alternative education description, which is described in more detail in the documentation as far as what the options need to be, and the additional SIF codes that you see here. You can see some of them do default, but can be changed if needed. And then once we've completed entering that information, we save and exit. And that's how to create an incident, assign it to a student, and where to find the references and resources that you need for the Massachusetts SIF discipline reporting.